Russian occupiers are fiercely striking Odessa region, trying to cut off half of the area by attacking two key strategic bridges in Zatoka and Mayaky. What is the situation with this right now? What is the enemy planning? And how are we responding? Find out in this episode, friends. Please subscribe to this YouTube channel. Don't forget to like and leave your comments. This is very important for the growth of our community. And let's not waste any time. Let's get started right away. Let's begin. So let's start with the facts. A brief chronology. On December 14th, there was a massive attack on the bridge in Zatoka. About 40 Shahed-type drones, 20 hits as reported in the press at the time. Railway connections with Budjak have been cut off since 2022 and are now damaged. Now, the highway is also affected. Next, on December 18th and 20th, there was a series of attacks on the road bridge in Mayaky. Drones and a ballistic missile were used, as reported by the media at the time. Today, friends, a new attack. Russian drones have attacked the bridge in Mayaky again. Let me remind you that on December 21st, after the previous attacks, traffic on the Odessa-Reni highway was only just restored. And now, once again, a new attack. The consequences of the morning shelling are still being clarified, but after the previous attacks, the consequences were as follows. Traffic, heavy vehicles on the key Odessa-Reni route, the M15 highway as it is known, were temporarily halted. It was difficult to reach as many as 12 border checkpoints with Moldova and Romania because there were certain problems. These include Palanca, Reni, Orlivka, and so on. In fact, after the attack on the bridge in Mayaky, the entire Bessarabia region, about 200 kilometers of territory with hundreds of thousands of residents, found itself, so to speak, in a transportation blockade. And this is really not an exaggeration. To understand the enemy's objective, you really need to grasp the value of this artery. The bridge in Mayaky is not just a crossing, it is in fact the only remaining functional route that connected Budjak, the southwestern part of Odessa region, with the rest of the oblast and Ukraine after the destruction of the bridge in Zatoka. First of all, it serves as the logistics route to the Danube ports, Izmail and Reni. And by the way, this is our air corridor after the blockade of the Black Sea ports. Through them, grain was exported and critically important goods were imported. Up to 60% of all fuel imports to Ukraine pass through these very ports. A strike on the bridges is a strike on our energy security. Yes, it should be noted right away that the government said there would be no problems with fuel after the attack, and indeed there were no fuel problems. But ultimately, we have to realize something. A large amount of fuel is transported precisely along this route. Next, another reason is the connection with the EU. Or rather, it's not a reason, but about how such logistical routes are used. This highway, friends, is a direct route to the border with Romania and Moldova, and then, as you understand, to the European Union. An expert, a well-known expert in the field of radio electronics, Serhiy Beskresnov, better known as Flash, he says directly, look, the Russians are specifically trying to cut off the Danube ports by paralyzing our logistics. And therefore, to strike a blow to both the economy and the army at the same time. We will discuss this issue with you separately. So the question arises, what is the goal? Why are Russian manufacturers doing this? What do they want to achieve? Experts highlight a whole range, a whole spectrum, and all of them are working simultaneously. Well, it should be said that the most obvious story is the economic and logistical objective: to paralyze the operation of the Danube ports, complicate supply chains, including military ones, and make the regions economically unviable. By the way, as I mentioned, the head of the Strategy 21 Centers program said the enemy has practically destroyed all logistics to the Danube ports. I don't know if it's really necessary to say it like that. After all, I didn't find any confirmation that all logistics had been destroyed. Meanwhile, that's his opinion, Pavlo Lakichak's. Next, friends, this is a psychological operation. It's actually very dangerous because, well, listen, Russia wants to create a sense of isolation among the residents of Budjak. You've been cut off, forgotten about, and so on and so forth. And in fact, this could work. They want to spread panic and helplessness. At first, it was about energy before the holidays. Now it's about roads, routes, bridges, and so on. And Serhiy Brachuk, with whom I often do interviews, in our last conversation told me that this is pressure. This is pressure meant to make people more compliant, to undermine trust in the authorities. Like, look, the authorities can't protect you, and so on. There are actually many more goals, and one of them is geopolitical and security related. Because isolating Budjak by creating a hotspot of security and humanitarian problems, as our military say, including National Guard serviceman Denis Sokolov, is their priority. They want to increase pressure on Moldova to exploit its own problems with Transnistria. to distract forces and attention because they want to force Ukraine to divert resources to rebuilding logistics and to defense instead of offense. So this needs to be considered as a whole. But the main thing, friends, in reality, from a military point of view, this does not give the Russian Federation any significant advantages on the front line. This is terrorism, this is a strike against civilian infrastructure, and it confirms that Russia wanted to disregard any rules of war and so on. Yes, of course, we're not children. We have to understand that military supplies also go along these routes. This is no secret. I'm not revealing any military secrets. The experts themselves say this directly, but in the end, there are other routes. It will just take longer. One way or another, we have to take this aspect into account. And here we come to probably the most painful question that people in the South are asking themselves. Aren't they, in effect, preparing a second Transnistria for us? Could Russia try to destabilize this region militarily? Let's start with Putin's threats, because he openly talked about striking port infrastructure as a response. He threatened to cut Ukraine off from the sea. Remember? When he met with the Americans not so long ago, he talked about how if Ukraine continues to destroy tankers, which he called piracy, by the way, we will cut Ukraine off from the sea, strike the ports, and so on. And Bujak is the target here. However, let's look at this realistically. A military landing from the sea or air? Well, listen, first of all, that would be suicide for the Russian Federation, especially under current conditions. Our forces are ready. An offensive from Transnistria? Well, I did a separate episode on this. They didn't do it in 2022 when they had the chance, and they won't do it now. And besides, they don't have enough resources there. Again, I refer you to the separate episodes about Transnistria. The head of the main intelligence directorate, well, not just the head, Budanov, but the main intelligence directorate as a whole, reported that Russia has recently become quite active in Transnistria. They are reactivating equipment, training drone system operators, and among other things, they are building drone manufacturing plants, reinstating conscription. All of this is very, very important. So we can't ignore these factors in our discussion. But for now, that's unrealistic. So what's the goal? It's to prepare the ground, so to speak, to create a situation where an isolated, blacked out region, because of blackouts and so on, with a paralyzed economy, will start to stew in its own juice, so to speak. This is the perfect environment for provocation, for creating tension. This is actually a long-term strategy aimed at exhaustion. Moreover, friends, I want to emphasize blocking an important military supply artery. Now, the most difficult part, what should be done if the bridges are actually destroyed? Right now, let me remind you, we don't know the consequences after the latest strike, but in the end, we haven't heard anything major. So do you want to believe that everything is okay? What will happen if the bridges are destroyed? There is only one backup route, and it goes through Moldova. And here we run into a problem there. Essentially, the problem is that there is a short stretch of road through Moldovan territory, which connects two parts of the Odessa region, as you know, but it's 8 kilometers with mandatory border control. This creates queues, it causes problems and delays. And for these, by the way, 8 kilometers, when I was preparing for this broadcast, I found an interesting piece of news, which I did not know before, that for these 8 kilometers, Ukraine once gave Moldova a section on the Danube for the Giurgiulesti port, which they later built. So what's next, friends? The only viable solution is to reach an agreement with Chisinau for the unhindered transit of all goods and people. And by the way, work in this direction is ongoing, as I understand it, so there shouldn't be any problems here. What is our government doing now, since the Odessa region is suffering? The issues of logistics and defense. The situation in Odessa region was discussed at the staff meeting. The last staff meeting was dedicated specifically to this. Its main focus is, first of all, strengthening the air defense of the region. Zelensky even announced a change of the commander of the Southern Air Command in order to improve the situation. He says that, yes, we may have certain problems with air defense there, but the command must find ways out of the situation. The second point is planning the restoration of logistics, rebuilding bridges, organizing crossings, and so on. Third, passive works on the southern border, especially near Transnistria. The main thing is that the problem is understood at the highest level, work is being done on it, and we hope that the situation will change. So, in fact, what do we have? First, attacks on bridges, friends, are not random acts of terror. They are part of Russia's systematic strategy. The goal is to economically weaken Ukraine, isolate Bujak, create a humanitarian crisis, and exert psychological pressure. Next are the direct threats of military seizure. There is no immediate threat of Bujak being captured, but there is a risk of its gradual destabilization through blockade. It should also be said that the weakest link right now is logistics. That is, quick decisions are needed to ensure connectivity with the region, and here diplomacy with Moldova is essential. The situation is not critical, but we see that the systematic strikes carried out by Russia could lead to a huge problem. That is why we need to talk about this now. Our actions should be to strengthen air defense, restore infrastructure, prevent the spread of internal panic, and of course, support the residents of the South, which I want to do right here in this episode because we know how difficult things are right now for the people of Odessa region and the city of Odessa in particular. And that's why Bujak cannot be cut off just by destroying bridges. But these attacks are a clear signal that the enemy is trying to strangle our South. Our roots, our connections with Europe. By understanding this strategy, we can not only defend ourselves better there, but also counteract more effectively. So let's support the armed forces of Ukraine. Friends, let's be careful and not spread panic. Together, we will definitely withstand this pressure, but it must be noted that the enemy has really focused on the South, unfortunately. And we will continue to cover these topics in our upcoming episodes. Take care of yourselves and all the best.